First counsel up today will be Counsel for Canada.
For the record, Hugh McCauley for the Government of Canada. With me is Jonas Spiegelman. Mr. Whitehouse and Dr. Riddle, I have not too many questions, a few clarification questions, and then a number of questions arising from your responses to some of the questions that Ms. Baker asked you earlier today. I've got a couple of questions about resources for stock assessment work, a couple of questions about linkages between stock assessment work and other initiatives, a few questions about collaborations around stock assessment, and then a question or two about the future of stock assessment. So I'll start with just a couple of hopefully fairly straightforward questions in terms of clarifications, and I'd ask that Mr. Lund bring up the Harvest Management Policy and Practice Report, which is PPR number 5, I understand. And Mr. Lund, if you could go to paragraph 26, which is on page 16. Mr. Whitehouse or Dr. Riddle, there's a reference in both paragraphs 26 and 27 to the Stock Assessment Coordination Committee, which you've spoken to, being a subcommittee of the Salmon Working Group, or SWG. Is that accurate?
No, the Salmon Working Group is not a subcommittee. Certainly shares a number of members in common, but it's not a subcommittee.
Is it fair to say that there's a working relationship, but it's not a subcommittee?
Correct, there is a working relationship.
Good, thank you. Mr. Lund, could you go then to page 80, paragraph 205, sub B, sub I? And the last two sentences of that sub-paragraph I'll just read. Visual surveys are done on foot, by boat, or by air, helicopter, or plane, and are calibrated annually. Visual surveys tend to underestimate populations. Mr. Whitehouse or Dr. Riddle, is there anything you'd like to say in terms of clarifying or correcting anything in those two sentences?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, their visual surveys do represent the class of estimation techniques that are identified here. We also extend, for example, a fence count is based on visual observation. So visual surveys also include a number of activities that aren't specifically captured in the foot, boat, or air surveys. The other thing I think that's important to clarify is with respect to calibration. So there are places where calibration is conducted annually in association with cyclical visual surveys. We didn't have the chance earlier today to get into the specific details, but there are two applications within the Fraser watershed of the visual survey techniques, broadly categorized. In the early Stewart system, we use annually calibrated visual escapement estimates. So we implement fences, and in those same streams, a paired visual survey to generate an annual calibration comparison between a visual survey and a total count into the system, and generate a calibration estimate on an annual basis for the remainder of the 38 streams within that group. The rest of the watershed is estimated using the visual techniques. This is the low precision estimates. But we don't calibrate that annually. We apply a standard expansion factor. So the standard expansion factor is based on historic work that was done by the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission and has been validated recently in the 90s by DFO.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehouse. Dr. Riddle?
Yeah, I think we should, not sure what this document is, I didn't catch the initial page, but this last visual surveys tend to underestimate populations. That's not strictly true because of the use of calibration. So if you're calibrating, you're trying to go from what we typically would call an index to a fixed number. That number and its accuracy to the true value is very much dependent on how many you count and whether you count them in at the right portion of the run and so on. And so it's not true to say that it's always an underestimate. If you have an uncalibrated count, there's no question it's an underestimate, because you count during just a few days when the run's protracted over maybe a month. But if you're calibrating that statement is not always true.
Thank you, that's helpful. And just, Dr. Riddle, for your benefit, this comes from the policy and practice report with respect to harvest management, just for your reference. Thank you very much, that was helpful. A question about allocation of resources for stock assessment. I asked Mr. Lunn to pull up document 1 from Canada's list of documents for stock assessment. Question to you, Mr. Whitehouse. This spreadsheet, as I understand it, serves to essentially bring forward information that Ms. Baker referred you to in a spreadsheet that's been marked as Exhibit 383. That information, as I understand it, and as I recall, went up until 2005, 2006. This document serves to bring that forward to 2008, 2009, and also, as I read it, is a more comprehensive listing of stock assessment budgets. I think that pink salmon, for example, are referred to. I guess my question is just, what other information should we draw from this document in terms of context and trends and that kind of thing?
I think a couple of pieces of clarification are required. First of all, this sheet does compare to the sheet that was presented earlier. It represents all species assessment budgets within the Fraser. It represents additional information to that which was presented earlier, as the earlier spreadsheet focused on a slightly different administrative structure at the time, so it was only programs that were implemented out of the BC interior area. As Brian mentioned, we reorganized right around the time of this, the time that earlier sheet was prepared. So this is much more comprehensive accounting of budgets for stock assessment activities. It shows the same type of information, well, exactly the same information with a couple of updates. In the 2005-06 year, there is new information that wasn't available at the time the earlier spreadsheet was prepared, which was May. So those extraordinary injections of dollars to address gaps in the assessment program are reflected in this sheet. They were not in the earlier sheet.
Thank you. I'd ask that be marked as the next exhibit. Just a couple of questions about some linkages between DFO's stock assessment work and some other initiatives that Mr. Commissioner has heard some testimony about. And I know that Mr. Commissioner and Ms. Baker have asked you about the wild salmon policy, and you've spoken about alignment in terms of CU's and DFO's stock assessment work. Are there other examples of stock assessment work being aligned with implementation of the wild salmon policy?
Sorry, I don't know that I follow the question. Do you mean outside of the Fraser?
No, just beyond simple alignment with CUs. Are there other examples, other parts of the wild salmon policy implementation that stock assessment is being aligned with? Sorry.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, after the conservation units, then in the fall, there was the presentation of estimation of benchmarks for Fraser sockeye for the first time. That's a major step forward, and that was Sue Grant and Kerry Holt and a number of people in Science Branch as the primary authors. There's been extensive work in the region on definition of habitat indicators under Strategy 2. Some of those have not been implemented in any sense yet, but there has been agreement reached on the indicators to measure. Less work on the ecosystem indicators yet, but as you've heard in our discussions today, for Fraser sockeye, certainly part of their ecosystem indicators is going to be dealing with the freshwater lake systems, so that would be underway. And there has been very limited progress in trying to implement a couple of pilots for integrated regional planning under Strategy 4. Neither of those examples that I'm aware of, though, are in the Fraser system.
No, I think Frizzy.
Oh, Frizzy.
The Frizzy
Yeah.
process would be specifically directed at implementing the integrated plan.
Yeah. So there's actually 3 sort of pilots, and Barkley Sound, Skeena River, and Frizzy.
Thank you. I think you've touched on this, and I know that you spoke of this morning in reference to the Nursery Lake productivity assessments being an example of a ecosystem focus for stock assessment work. Are there other examples of the concept of ecosystem-based management being employed in DFO's stock assessment work?
I think there's a number of examples, particularly arising from some of the challenges associated with explaining patterns that we're seeing. The Strait of Georgia Ecosystem Initiative, under the direction of Dr. Beamish, would represent a specific and directed attempt at incorporating ecosystem values and assessment into management. When I step back and think about the wild salmon policy implementation, I have a slightly different perspective as to what the pieces in terms of are we moving forward are. The reality to me, a number of the activities that we do have always been well aligned with that, and the stock assessment, in fact, supports the delivery of the wild salmon policy. It's just the frame through which you're looking at it, really, that brings a number of the context pieces together under that particular construct. So taking an approach that looks at life history-based assessment really does align with the concept of ecosystem-based approach and integrated planning in understanding stock dynamics. So I think there's a number of examples within Fraser sockeye and outside Fraser sockeye with respect to management approaches used in Chinook and Coho, where we use Cote d'Ivoire tagging to understand life history and fishery-specific impacts, really plug into that same sort of framework in a general sense.
Thank you. Dr. Riddle?
Well, I mean, this is all true, but I think the new element where we talk about the benchmarks, certainly a major change in implementation of the policy will be the definition of the lower benchmark, not just the upper benchmark, which is more typically described as the management target. And that, so the lower benchmark is very new and will be, a significant addition. The ecosystem-based, it really depends on where you're looking. Of course, we look at marine indicators now as far as affecting marine survival of sockeye. I think as we look more in the Strait of Georgia, for example, when I was listening to Sue Grant's presentation on forecasting, and she put up plots of the marine indicators that are currently discussed in forecasting, you may have noticed that there was not a single indicator there for the Strait of Georgia. Right? So would it have improved if we had had indicators of the Strait of Georgia and not the open ocean? All right, so there are steps that we need to take to really improve that.
Thank you. Turning to just a few questions about collaborations between DFO and other organizations with respect to stock assessment work. You've spoken about collaboration between DFO and First Nations, and in particular projects with the NSTQ. Perhaps a question to Mr. Whitehouse. Are there other examples in the Fraser watershed of collaborations between DFO and First Nations or Aboriginal organizations that you'd like to describe for us?
Numerous examples that I can highlight. We work extensively throughout the watershed with First Nations groups. Through the AFS agreement in the northern part of the watershed, we undertake joint both adult and juvenile assessments with the Carrier-Sakani Tribal Council. I spoke about the arrangements that we've had with the NSTQ in the Quesnel system, partnering with external funding sources, Fraser Salmon and Watersheds Initiative, and an umbrella group that represents a collective of First Nations in the upper portion of the watershed, the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, have been partnered in that project. We've worked extensively with the Chilcotin National Government in the Chilco system on both sockeye stock assessment at the adult and at the juvenile stages. We're working extensively with them on a Chinook program as well. I can highlight numerous examples of additional collaborative efforts with First Nations throughout most of the rest of the watershed. We have a variety of different business models depending upon the various capacities that First Nations groups have to engage in stock assessment work, and we're working to assist through participation both directly and indirectly in DFO delivered projects. We also have a substantial degree of interaction and work with groups other than First Nations, funding sources through the Pacific Salmon Treaty Southern Boundary Fund have contributed in a substantial way in supporting stock assessment work within the Fraser. Telemetry work, evaluating migratory success for late runs, summer runs, and early summer runs throughout the watershed. We've worked with Brian's group, the Salmon Foundation, in evaluating new technology associated with assessing smolts, as we talked about earlier, the telemetry work. There are additional linkages to groups like the Fraser Salmon Watersheds Initiative, which is another externally funded, well, DFO funds it, but it's managed by an external board in terms of priority identification, and we worked on calibration programs to assist DFO with better understanding the relationship associated with change in methodologies. Talked about a number of these things earlier. And finally, a substantial amount of work in association with academic institutes, in particular Dr. Scott Hinch's lab at UBC and his association with Dr. Cook out of Carleton University, who specialize in bioenergetics and fish migration. Our program has served as an essential springboard to facilitate a great deal of that research that has gone on both in the main stem of the Fraser and the lower river and in the terminal areas where they've been investigating fish health and fish bioenergetics issues. So there's a great deal of integration in terms of the stock assessment components, delivery, tapping into sources of expertise external to the department, and in attempts to develop capacity within groups to contribute in a meaningful way to stock assessment.
Operations with First Nations, you've referred to funding for those projects that DFO does with First Nations being funded from the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy. Just to link this back to my question, the questions you had from Ms. Baker about budgets and whatnot, does that money supplement the stock assessment budgets that we've been looking at, or is that part of?
It is a supplement. It has a specific purpose that within the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, capacity building is one of specific objectives, and as we've heard, stock assessment is a specific aspiration. Participation meaningfully is a specific objective for First Nations, and a number of groups have chosen within their AFS agreements to particularly target stock assessment as a capacity building area. So that funding brings the capacity to allow people to participate in the projects where we would not have the money to treat our budgets as a training budget. So there has been substantial benefit to that approach in capacity development.
Thank you. Just segueing to, and you've already done it, but broadening the scope to collaboration with other partners, you referred to the Fraser Salmon and Watersheds program, which, as I understand it, is a program, it's got a number of partners, and I'll ask you about that, but I think it's run, and you can correct me, by the Pacific Salmon Foundation and the Fraser Basin Council. One or both of you, perhaps Dr. Riddle would be well placed to respond to this. Could you just describe what that program is and what its objectives are?
Well, the Fraser Salmon Watershed Program was a 5-year program implemented in 2006. It builds on an initial grant from BC Living Rivers funds for the province, and our share is about $12.5 million. That money was then used to go to the federal government and seek matching funds, of which they got $5 million in cash and $5 million of in-kind labor from staff within the Fraser Basin. The objectives of the program are to develop a more sustainable set of communities within the Fraser Basin, sustainability of salmon in the Fraser Basin. So we work in agriculture, habitat restoration, water management, new assessment tools, and fisheries planning and governance. And that. So it's a fairly widely diversified. It is jointly managed by the Fraser Basin Council and the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And it's a major problem right now because it terminates March 2011. And so we are in the last year of these funds. The program will be reduced because we're actually saved money to extend it 1 year. But there is no continuation of those funds agreed to at this time.
Thank you.
Could I pick up on a point here? I think it's important to understanding the ability of programs with limited time funding to actually meaningfully contribute to stock assessment objectives. We talked about earlier today, it's very important that we have consistency and long-term commitment to ongoing assessment when it comes to Fraser sockeye and all species. This is crucial. One of the business models that is being forwarded as a way to continue with the delivery of a number of program aspects associated with stock assessment is tapping into sources like the Salmon Watersheds Initiative, like the Southern Boundary Fund. One of the real risks that creates is the short-term nature of those fundings. What happens, and we have to be quite careful in managing this, is the expectations created along the lines of what is doable with the resourcing available and what are priorities. Because there is a potential cross-messaging that occurs when a short-term funding strategy comes in, injects some money into something that may be a short-term priority, but then potentially is viewed as something that elevates in priority when that money goes away and potentially cuts into core funding. That's the importance of my stressing earlier on that there needs to be, for example, a commitment to making certain that that escapement monitoring is the core base, and that we don't see that if the Salmon Watershed Initiative goes away and has funded a program that is linked to hydroacoustics at Mission, that we then have to go and find a source within the internal funds to find that. There are clearly strategic places where significant value added to short-term funding sources. But when you look at the short-term nature of them, by design, there's a disconnect with what we need to support as the underlying foundation for stock assessment and salmon management assessment.
Timur makes me think of probably an important point. I mean, the Salmon Foundation, as one of the originators of the Fraser Salmon Watershed Program, we are talking to government about new types of funding, but we're not asking directly for more funding. And the reason for this is that and obviously I'm sensitive to this for my background, but if there's a continuous reduction of funds, asking them for more money for fisheries work will very likely impact DFO. I'm telling people that I talk to in Ottawa that I'd rather you put your money into stabilizing stock assessment so you have this core ongoing task, and that just open up how we can raise money and we can do it ourselves. Right now there are a number of regulations that limit how I can raise funds to put into various salmon activities. If those were more flexible in how we can raise funds, I'd rather see government stabilizing the resources in a place like the Fraser sockeye, for example, or doing the early marine survival work in the Strait of Georgia. But right now it's, who do you take the money or give the money to? Within government, or do you give it to a nonprofit? And that, so.
Opportunities in the future for collaboration between DFO and partner organizations, thinking of First Nations and interior universities and other outside organizations for freshwater ecology research generally and stock assessment work in particular? Dr. Riddle?
Absolutely. I won't make a joke of it. I mean, I've been talking to people for months about exactly that. Things have changed in the interior. We have 2 universities, previously colleges, now fully rated universities that are required to do science. They're required to do research to keep their status. And that's a Thompson River University, is small but growing, substantial money from advanced education program in the province. For the first time this year, I spent a couple of days up in Prince George at UNBC. Excellent people there with wanting to work in freshwater ecology. And so we're talking about setting up, saying we again to confuse the commissioner, but this time, sir, I'm talking about myself finding money through the Pacific Salmon Foundation, working with the universities through NSERC, and that because they can apply for their science programs and with students. And the intention would be to establish a freshwater ecology center at the old Quesnel hatchery. And in Timbers area in Kamloops, there's significant interest in working with students there on understanding the dynamics of Shuswap Lake. UMBC could be ideally suited to study the Stewart Lake system and what's limiting production of juvenile sockeye in that lake. So I think we have great new opportunities for developing what I'm calling a network of common interests, and that First Nations clearly are interested. I've even talked to the universities about a U.S. model. For years they called it the fisheries co-op programs. And what they were is applied science through the universities directed to conservation and restoration of salmon in their particular interest on the West Coast. The aspect of that is you could have a fisheries or a salmon cooperative that is targeted at building capacity in First Nations right in their particular areas. You could do it through a networked university. You don't have to go to Vancouver and that. And so I think we have opportunities now to build networks that we've never done before, and to draw in more money through multiple sources on that.
Thank you. Mr. Whitehouse, did you have anything to add to that?
I agree with Brian's characterization. I think that the First Nations aspect of this is an important one. I think that we clearly, as we see the ability of these organizations to support science-based organizations, and this is one of the keys in making the connection. The stock assessment work is a science-based activity. When we see the move, and we're seeing it on numerous fronts at various degrees throughout the watershed, First Nation organizations able to support science-based programming, and it will only improve the ability to collaborate on project delivery and potentially extension through accessing additional resources that can extend the ability of the programs overall to meet resource assessment objectives. So I see that as very critical. I think the work that we're doing with the academic institutes has already demonstrated the potential value for strategic input, and I think the model that Brian has identified has real potential as well.
Thank you. My last question is about the future of stock assessment, and specifically about the use of technology. You've spoken about DIDSON technology and the use of it, about sonic tagging and other things. Does the use of more technology provide opportunities for doing better and perhaps more cost-effective stock assessment work in the future?
I'll tackle that initially from the perspective of spawning grounds. I think we've already got demonstration that new technology, and this is the DIDSON that I'm referring to, has a potential to allow us to estimate stocks to high levels of precision more cost effectively. It's important to understand, though, that DIDSON has a specific application. It isn't going to work everywhere. There are a number of places in the watershed you're simply not going to be able to overcome the issues of fish migration patterns, the configuration types of water, the mixed stock nature for providing resolution down to individual spawning levels, that the technology will not be the panacea. It's not going to come in and solve all issues. We're not going to be able to avoid having large marker capture, high intensity, high cost programs throughout the watershed. But we will be able to make smaller incremental gains through the use of technology. There is other technology. It's not particularly new, but it's being applied more and more. Resistivity counters, different types of electronic counting gear that have the potential to aid in assessing more cost effectively smaller populations to a higher degree of precision. It's mapping the information need with the tools and the range of tools that you have. When you start to extend to things like the tagging programs, they've already demonstrated radio telemetry is not new, acoustic telemetry is newer. Both of them have already been able to assist in clarifying issues of migratory success of returning adults as they move through marine approach areas into the river. When you couple telemetry with some of the projects that we've worked collaboratively with Brian and others on at Quailark, there may be alternate ways of understanding potential system bias associated with some of the tools that we use currently. So they have an opportunity to impact. There's nothing that looks like the sort of silver bullet that's going to answer all the questions. And we have to rigorously evaluate what kind of contributions these tools can make to our overall assessment objectives, such that we are staying true to the management objectives within the system.
There will be a difficult transition, particularly under the MOU that was pointed out. There's always great hesitation to change how we're doing Fraser sockeye assessment. And that, so, I mean, I think the reality is that you probably would have to have a targeted sort of 5-year program to look at implementation and verification that it's just as good, and build some confidence in that program. I think people have simply not spent a great deal of time looking at the scale of what that full implementation would be, because there simply is not a reality of getting money to do that in the immediate term. If we thought we could really implement that, and we had access to a few new DITSNs, and we could apply some of these technologies, including the lower cost sort of resistivity counters, these are mats basically that you put on the floor of the stream, and they do very well counting fish going across them, and that they have to be put in the right place, just like a DITSN. And that, so there are clearly opportunities for us to apply technology. I think it would be cheaper overall in the long run, but I think you do have an upfront cost that's going to be fairly substantial in initially capital and then testing.
Mission not to flag it here, and that is biotechnology and its ability to help understand fish health issues. I think the work that Christy Miller-Saunders is doing with genetic arrays, looking at the ability to understand fish health well away from the freshwater approach areas, has significant ability to improve understanding of potential disease pathogens and their impact on production patterns. So should also acknowledge that as a high-tech issue, I think, technology.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Thank you. The next council is Tim Leadham.
Mr. Commissioner, I understand that you want to adjourn at 4:15. I wondered if you'd be kind enough to reserve a few minutes before the 4:15 cutoff to discuss scheduling. I do have something I wish to raise with the Commission regarding the future scheduling. Thank you.
For the record, Leadham initial T, appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. I find that most of the questions that I was going to put to you gentlemen have already been asked and answered. They've dealt primarily with the wild salmon policy. It's gratifying that other participants are asking those kinds of questions. The one area that I wanted to focus on the wild salmon policy was on strategy 2, the habitat that you alluded to, Dr. Riddell. And I'm wondering if there's some linkages, Mr. Whitehouse, to some of the evidence that you gave earlier with respect to the juvenile fry assessment, where you were actually looking at habitat as well. And I'm wondering if that information can somehow be fed into developing habitat indicators for the wild salmon policy, so that we can actually have some cost savings measures here.
Not sure I fully understand the question. But I'll take a stab at it. I think there are, in association with a number of the assessment pieces, clear linkages to habitat. For example, incubation habitat and fry assessment programs, understanding the coupling between capacity of spawning grounds to support productive incubation, and understanding the relationship between spawner density and declines in production. There could be links that could establish whether or not we're seeing, if we were to assess in a systematic way fry production out of incubation habitat, there may be ways to link to processes operating on river-type scales that would assist in understanding whether or not we're seeing processes that have eroded habitat capacity as opposed to representing density-dependent impacts. But as I extend that into understanding the impact and the relationship between lake environment, for example, gets more difficult because there's a much more broad suite of impacting factors, development, in addition to fish-related impacts. Broad indicators, nothing is leaping to mind to me right now with that respect.
Okay, I'll leave
Well,
that.
could I add just quickly? I mean, I think maybe you're touching on something that we've actually been talking about within this Fraser Salmon Watershed Program that we just referred to, in the sense that the critical thing in the future for Fraser sockeye, of course, is to sustain high-quality water in the lakes. And so I think that a habitat indicator could well be for shoreline development, road access, simple things like this that measure the distribution of developments and cottages, and what is the current effluent policies around the lakes. Certainly this year up at the Adams brought home to me very clearly that there was this significant debate in that area in the past 2 years about the development of a huge marina that would have butted up very close to the Adams River. I think that developments like that are not going to be good for the sustainability of some of these important stocks. And maybe we really need to look at targeting property acquisition. And it doesn't have to be government, because we have things like nature trusts that exist to do that sort of thing, where we could buy reserves or put it in conservation easements. But we should be looking at critical habitats for these very important sockeye salmon in particular we're talking about. I think it could be more general to other salmon. But I think there are very close ties between strategies 1 and 2. In implementation of these, we see the strategies 1, 2, and 3 as all being integrated in a sort of really it's a conservation unit plan to look at the importance of habitat and how you have to manage it in the future.
Mr. Commissioner, mindful of the time, and I know we want to get going at 4:15, perhaps I'll just cede the floor to Mr. Rosenblum at this time.
Mr. Commissioner, I don't wish my remarks to be in the slightest interpreted as a criticism of the Commission Council and their conduct in this section of the hearing. Quite the contrary. I think the evidence has gone in obviously a very professional way. However, what is developing here is a situation where panels are being called, where cross-examination is sometimes embarked upon but not completed. We're ending up in a situation where this is, I believe, the 4th occasion where a panel has been put over to another date for cross-examination. In the case of wild salmon policy, I was in the middle of a cross-examination that's been put off, and who knows when that might be carried on. It becomes obviously a danger to this process where too many panels are sitting out there in orbit waiting for instructions to land and to come back before this inquiry. It puts a tremendous challenge on council in terms of resuscitating their own interests, their own area review of the file and the areas that they want to cover in cross-examination when there is this disjointed process where a panel tenders part of its evidence, but the cross-examination takes place another time. There may not be an easy answer to this. I totally respect the problems that Commission Counsel is facing in terms of panels that are upcoming, that are committed to those dates, that are being brought before this inquiry, some of them having to fly into town from other regions of the province. But I would ask the Commission to really reflect upon how this habit, if I can put it this way, has developed, so that as of today, this is the fourth panel that I believe has been put into abeyance where there will be cross-examination on some occasion other than with complete continuity day to day in succession. And it concerns me, and it will even more concern me if this continues where instead of 4 panels, we have 5, 6, and 7 panels. It puts a lot of pressure on, I believe, you, Mr. Commissioner, in terms of your continuity of understanding, and it certainly does of counsel in the cross-examination. I simply wanted to put that to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenblum. I can say that I am mindful of the concern you raise. I can assure you that no one is more mindful of that than is Commission Counsel, because they too have these pressures of trying to juggle the attendance of these witnesses. So thank you for your remarks. We certainly will keep it in mind and reflect upon it as we move forward into the balance of the hearings and the scheduling challenges that we will face, no doubt, in ensuring that we can try to do as you're suggesting, which is keep the flow in a way that doesn't have witnesses under cross-examination out, as it were, from the witness box for days or weeks at a time. So I'm grateful for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Could Commission Counsel inform us, as I'm sure you would have in any event, when we might anticipate this panel to return for the completion of the cross-examination?
Yeah, Mr. Commissioner, our plan for tomorrow is to start with Gord Starrett, who's been brought down from the Interior and has been waiting to get on for a few days now. So I want to have him go up first thing in the morning, and I don't think his evidence will be very long. So I'm hoping that we can complete his evidence before the morning break, if possible. Hopefully that's possible. And then bring back the panel that we started yesterday to complete that cross-examination. Now, if my friends think that the cross-examination of that panel can complete before the end of the day tomorrow, we might be able to. I've asked both these witnesses; they're able to be here tomorrow, but it really depends on the time that my friends will be taking with yesterday's panel to complete that cross-examination. So there are the balls in the air. If people can complete their cross-examination of the decision-making panel by 3 o'clock, depending on how much time they think they're going to need, or 2:30. I mean, I don't know. It's difficult to say because I don't know exactly where people are going to land on that time. But these witnesses are able to come back tomorrow